Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
It's difficult for many people to buy a home in Milwaukee, even if they do have a stable job. WUWM is examining the systemic problems that contribute to this challenge and some potential solutions in our series called Seeking Solutions: Keys to Homeownership. Today, we'll look at how redlining has created barriers to homeownership for people of color. Redlining was a discriminatory practice that labeled homes in Black and brown communities as too risky for loans. WUWM's Eddie Morales spoke with Dr. Kirk Harris. Harris is a UW-Milwaukee professor and director of the Center for Equity Practice and Planning Justice.
So in order to understand redlining, I think we have to start with the history of America, and that history is deeply embedded in the racialized notions of placemaking, meaning that from chattel slavery to the existence and construction of Jim Crow to the development of segregation that was supported vis-a-vis the separate but equal doctrine, all of which have led to what we understand is a kind of a hyper-segregated America. But redlining emerged directly from governmental practices. Early in the part of the 20th century, we had public housing, and public housing was actually for white folks. It was provided an alternative so that those individuals could be stabilized from a housing perspective and then move to other forms of housing. That housing, at its inception, public housing as we knew it from its inception, was segregated. But over the course of time, particularly as we exited the Second World War, there was an effort by government to recognize the shortage of housing that existed for returning members from the armed services. And part of that effort to support that was to accelerate the development of housing. Prior to that, it's interesting that most folks could not afford housing because typically in order for you to afford a house, you had to put down a huge down payment, and the mortgage on the house had to be paid off very quickly in a short period. And it really created a constraint for opportunities for housing for the average American.
How did other factors play a role, like housing policies and banks?
Government stepped in and said, we're going to guarantee these loans that are issued by banks so that the average American can now afford a home with a small down payment. And that actually accelerated the development of what we now know as suburbanized housing, because what it did was it provided opportunities for demand for housing at a much higher rate, and it provided the expansion of single-family ownership by the average American. And when I say the average American, the average white American, because the initial efforts in this approach did not support for mortgages to areas that were for Black buyers or buyers of color. And the government created Homeowners Loan Corporation, which essentially was the body that served as the guarantor of these loans and constructed the policies which restricted the availability of loans based on race. And the assumption was that where you had communities that were potentially racially integrated or had Black folks in it, it created a decline in the property values and created uncertainty as to the stability of said investment, which made those investments from the argument from the bank vantage point not secure investments. And as such, governmental policy then sought to ensure that housing was essentially not available to communities of color, with the assumption that was not built on any research or any evaluative study that communities that were tend to be Black or brown were less stable and less worthy of investment. And so what the strategy was to essentially, through these practices, create areas that were redlined, those areas in which the investment was considered to be risky, right? In which case, those areas were not subject to support by banks. So at the earlier part of the 20th century, we had this interesting phenomena of housing opportunity and housing development by government for essentially the white population that excluded the black population. And what was interesting about that is that not only the FHA, was a supplemental governmental authority to run these programs along with the VA, which also provided supports for housing, both of which were exclusionary in that regard. And so redlining is responsible not only for the underdevelopment of Black community in terms of wealth, but it also segregated those communities because those communities were then deprived of resources. They were deprived of investment. And many of those areas that were deprived of those investments then in the early part of the 20th century, guess what? They're the same communities that are deprived of investments today. So what we essentially have is the remnants of that system has created a systemic embedded disadvantage that has defined a large portion of our urban environments as racially segregated. And as such, redlining is the kind of the culprit for that in the practices of governmental policy, reinforced, by the way, by private bank practices as well.
You're listening to Lake Effect on WUWM. I'm Eddie Morales speaking with Dr. Kirk Harris about redlining. Can you talk a little bit more about how zoning played a role?
Single family lots with homes sitting on single family lots are a lot more expensive. And so large lot zoning is often the mechanism via economic exclusion, which is intimately linked to racial exclusion that has fostered this problem. Also, racial covenants. Can't forget the notion of racial covenants, which was the history of America. And in fact, in Milwaukee, Ann Bonds and Derek Hadley have been doing a lot of really good work on identifying the history of racial covenants, which are essentially agreements, contractual agreements that restrict the sale of land based on race. And you'll find that in Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, those covenants proliferate. They're no longer enforceable, but they still actually exist on the deeds of homes that were previously under those contractual relationships. And now the remnants of all of that continually gets replicated because we have not addressed the uneven distribution of opportunity at the urban level to essentially deconstruct these problems.
Can you touch on what redlining looked like specifically in Milwaukee and which neighborhoods and groups of people were most affected?
Well, people that are most affected by redlining in Milwaukee and other places typically are Black communities. And you can look at any community. I mean, as you know, Milwaukee is one of the most highly segregated cities in the country. And you can look at the communities in which many Black communities exist, and you can see the stark segregation that exists between them and their peer white communities. And so I think pick a community that's Black in Milwaukee, it's segregated. So, and I think that history is just endemic because of the structural challenges that exist that undergird how that racial segregation kind of initiated and how it continues to maintain itself over time.
Is there anything that I haven't asked or that we haven't talked about so far that you feel like would be important to include?
As a planner, I always like to talk about solutions and how to address some of these larger structural issues. And I think one of the ways to begin to address this racialized placemaking and the impacts that uneven distribution of opportunities has created as a function of racial segregation, I've been doing a lot of discussion and thinking about what we call community wealth building. For example, talking about living wages and the opportunities to move people into opportunities so that they can actually support themselves, their families, have discretionary income to maybe even save to buy a home. So thinking about the role that governmental policy and economic development can play in creating better and more secure living wage jobs is a really important element to kind of advancing the opportunities and breaking the cycle that we see in segregated communities. The other is there's an affordability crisis in many cities, including Milwaukee. People can't afford the housing. And why can't they afford the housing? Because a lot of the land that exists that is vacant is being subject to speculation. In Milwaukee, for example, it's being gobbled up by, and homes are being gobbled up by external out-of-town investors. And that has, for example, pushed up rents and other things artificially. And it has, in some of the economic development practices that have been attended to that, have also created pressures for displacement and gentrification. So how can we solve that problem? One of the things that we can do is we can give communities more control over land. I've been having some conversations about the role that land trusts can play in giving communities much more control over the land that exists in their community, and having them to be the arbiters of the ways in which that land is used, and mitigating this speculation, which often leads to the displacement that vulnerable communities experience.
That was Dr. Kirk Harris, Director of the Center for Equity Practice and Planning Justice at UW-Milwaukee. Harris spoke with WUWM's Eddie Morales. This interview is part of our Seeking Solutions Keys to Homeownership series. Support for the series comes from presenting sponsor, Educators Credit Union. You can find all of our coverage at wuwm.com/housing. And tune in tomorrow for our next story about solutions to increase homeownership.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.